Hi, in this MuseumIndex Plus demonstration, I'm going to do a brief overview of cataloguing of objects in wholes and parts. And by that I mean many objects in the collection, sculptures and paintings, drawings and prints and so on. There's just a single part. The object is a single physical item. But some objects are more complicated than that. Let's just do a search and find some objects to illustrate this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm searching for objects where the number of parts is at least 3. I'll find some objects that have some images as well. So all of these objects have at least 3 parts to them. Let's look at this one as an example. So this beautiful mechanical globe clock, if we look at the inventory information for this object, you can see it's actually got 11 parts. There's the globe, there's the movement within the globe, and there are various fragments of the object. Each of these parts, if we look at the globe, it's got its own object number, object name, a brief description of that part, and it's got its own location. So if we look at the movement, again the movement has an object name, a part name, and a location. When we catalogue this object, we have this banner up here which describes, it's what we call an aspect. So if we consider this object with 11 parts, one aspect of the object is the whole object, and most of the cataloguing that we see here is about the whole object, the materials that comprise the whole object, the history of the whole object, references to the whole object, the condition of the whole object, and so on and so on. Now, a section here that we've not really looked at before, I open this up. This tells us which parts are in this aspect. So the whole object is always all the parts. So all 11 parts are in the whole object. But if I pick a different aspect, this object's been catalogued. So there's, for example, an aspect called the celestial globe. And if I look at that, you can see that only one part is in that aspect. That's part 2461. And that essentially is the celestial globe. And having picked that separate aspect, you can see that there's additional cataloguing. So, for example, we have the dimensions here of the celestial globe. Similarly, if we look at the movement, again, you can see we've got some dimensions specifically about this part of the object, the movement. You can also see with the images here, if I go back to look at the whole object, these 4 images are all about the whole object. These 2 are specifically linked to the movement, and you can see when I switch to the movement aspect, those 2 images come to the front. Those are the images that relate to this aspect that I'm looking at. I think maybe to better understand the relationship between aspects and parts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more aspect here. The way this particular object's been catalogued, there are some fragments in an envelope, and they've actually been assigned their own aspects. That was largely the result of a data migration rather than a deliberate choice. The way more typically you'd catalogue that is we would add a new aspect and we just call it fragments. And then once we've added that aspect, what I can do, if I go in and edit the parts section, and over here what we now see is a series of tick boxes, and I can basically say which parts of the object, which physical parts, each of which has its own object number, which physical parts are in the aspect I've called fragments. So I can say that it's this one, and then each of these. So now when I'm looking at, when I'm thinking about the aspect I've called fragments, what that actually means is this collection of parts. And I could now go on to do cataloging for fragments. So if I go into the description and dimensions section, I could say that the fragments are largely, let's just say that they're basically copper. And so I can apply that, link copper to my thesaurus. And now what I've got is some additional cataloging for the fragments. So there's copper in the fragments. If we go back to the movement, we can see that there's no particular materials specific to the movement. And if I look at the whole object is largely copper alloy, steel, and gilt. So this this relationship between the aspects, and if I just scroll back up to this parts section, the parts in the aspect, it's quite powerful, because it means if you're cataloging an object, perhaps which has a box and then a whole series of metallic components, you can describe the whole object as a boxed toy, for example, and then create an aspect called components, put all those metallic bits into the components aspect and catalog that. So if you've got many similar parts, you don't have to catalog them individually. You can just create a single aspect that covers all of those similar parts. I want to show you another way in which we can use these aspects when actually there is only a single part. What I'm going to do is just see if I can find an example of a coin. Don't have any object photography here, but this is a coin. So not surprisingly, it only has a single part, which is the coin itself. And it has the whole aspect where we describe the coin. We can also have aspects for single part objects. So if I create an aspect here, what I might choose to do at this point is add an aspect called obverse, and another aspect called reverse. So I have three aspects to my single part object, the whole object, the front of the coin and the back of the coin, if you like. So I can pick obverse, and then when I go into the cataloging here, I could perhaps use the inscriptions field to say that on the obverse of the coin we have a crown, line, something like that, and then perhaps on the reverse of the coin we have another inscription, which is the shield and anchor. Now if I save that object, so now what we can do over here, in fact, is we can show the data for all the aspects at the same time. So now you can see, if we scroll down to the description section, the whole coin is has its own description. It has materials and techniques, and it has a set of dimensions. But in addition, I've added an inscription that's specific to the obverse aspect of the coin, and I've added an inscription that's specific to the reverse of the coins. So single part objects can still have multiple aspects. Let's just go back to our multi-part search result as well. One other feature of wholes and parts that I wanted to show you is that sometimes, so when I do a search, typically I think what people want to retrieve are what they think of as their objects. You know, if I look here, for example, this toy, actually there's a toy and it's in a box. So there's a box base, a box lid, and a box toy. We think of that as a single object, and generally when I do a search, I want to get back one record that describes that entire object. Just occasionally we want to think in terms of parts. Perhaps we're doing location or movement control, which I'm going to cover in a separate video, but I want to see this as a series of parts. So instead of seeing 44 objects here, I can switch to the part view of my current search result. And what I actually have now are 437 separate parts. You can see these are all the parts of my globe clock as separate records. And these are the parts of this crozier. Then I can go back to my whole object. I can break down an individual object into its parts. So if we look at just the globe clock, again, I can switch to the part view of the current object. And these are just the parts of that object. And I can mark these like I can mark any other search result and show just those particular parts. And then I can do things like modify the location of those parts or do an audit of the location of those parts or a report on part level information. And I think that basically concludes what I wanted to show you on the subject of wholes, parts and aspects. Thank you.